and welcome to another video. Have you spent months and months learning Portuguese only to realize that you've been learning Brazilian Portuguese? Don't despair, we're going to fix it. I'm Amanda. I've been living in Portugal for over 30 years. I've been speaking Portuguese for over 30 years, and I've been teaching Portuguese to people just like you for over 20 years. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, do so now, and don't forget to click on that bell to get the latest notifications. So how are we going to fix your Brazilian Portuguese? One thing we have to do is get rid of this stigma of Brazilian Portuguese, European Portuguese. It's perfectly okay to call it European Portuguese. It's not a problem. The Portuguese language is a Romance language, and it's heavily influenced by Celtic, Germanic, Greek and Arabic influences. It was spoken in the Iberian Peninsula before as the Galician Portuguese, and with the formation of Portugal in the 12th century, the language evolved into the Portuguese that we know today. So the Spanish province of Galicia to the north of Portugal, the native language is still Galician to today. Both Portuguese and Galician are very similar, and natives can understand each other pretty well as they share the same common ancestor. Portuguese and Spanish are different languages, although they share 89% of their lexicon. So let's take a look at the Portuguese or European Portuguese. Some people really get their knickers in a twist over this. There is no need. Portuguese of Portugal, Iberian Portuguese, Peninsular Portuguese, dialects of Portuguese language spoken in Portugal, Angola, Mozambique, São Tomé, Príncipe, Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau. It's spoken in all these places. Now the word European was chosen so that it wouldn't clash with the words Portuguese. So they decided to call it European Portuguese, like we call it Brazilian Portuguese, European Portuguese. So the Portuguese doesn't really sound that good. Mozambique and Angola, they also speak Portuguese, but this is also heavily influenced by Bantu languages. And this, even though they're contemporary standard European Portuguese, what happens here is we've kind of got somewhere between the Portuguese as spoken in Europe and the Portuguese as spoken in Brazil. So we kind of have an in-between kind of way of speaking here. It's actually quite nice. I like to hear it. So how can we fix your Brazilian Portuguese? Well, it's not easy to relearn something once you've learned it, especially if you've already acquired a good vocabulary. It can be even harder to break the habit, but it's worth a try. The Brazilian Portuguese can often be easier to understand. Now, I found this when I was learning Portuguese. I used to watch a lot of soap operas, and I used to understand what they were saying. The Portuguese tend to shorten their vowels, whereas the Brazilians tend to elongate them. And you find that when you're listening to them, they're much more articulate. You can hear everything they say much clearer than you can with the Portuguese. Now, there are also some letters and vowels that have different sounds. One of the letters we're going to look at today is the letter T. So the letter T in the Brazilian pronunciation can be quite different. So we hear this often in the word noite. So we have the word noite. In Portuguese we say noite. In the Brazilian Portuguese they say
noite. Noite.
But we say noite. And then the similar thing happens with the letter D. We have
tarde. Tarde.
Whereas in European Portuguese we say tarde. Now we may notice something with the E here. The Brazilians tend to go heavy on the E. So they'll say noite and tarde. Whereas we would just say noite and tarde. So we don't really pronounce the E in the same way either. This can be a little tricky when you are first learning. These different sounds that we get can be very tricky in the beginning. The letter L at the end of a word in Brazilian can be pronounced like a W. So you might hear certain words pronounced in European Portuguese are going to be slightly different to the ones you've learned in Brazilian. So we can take a look at an example of some of those words now, which would be Natal. So in European Portuguese, we say Natal. In the Brazilian Portuguese, they're going to pronounce that L at the end slightly different. So it's going to be more of a W at the end rather than an L. So it's going to sound like
Natal. Natal.
And then we've got the same with the word
Legal.
but we say legal. Lisboa and levar. At the beginning of a word, it's going to sound exactly the same. So there's not going to be really any difference there at all. So you can see the differences here with the L at the end of the word. They can be a little tricky. We've got a few more words that are actually completely different words. So if we look at these words now, we can see that we've got the word for train. We've got trem, comboio. So in Brazilian, it's going to be trem, and in Portuguese, it's comboio. Now, the interesting thing about this is they both come from English words. So the word trem comes from the word train, and the word comboio comes from the word convoy. Next, we've got ônibus. Ônibus, which is autocarro in Portuguese. Autocarro. And then we have cachorro. Cachorro in Brazilian is dog. In Portuguese, we say cão. The Brazilians will say moça, menina, garota. And in Portugal, we will use the word rapariga, more for girl, or menina. Some people do use moça, but we tend to use more rapariga and menina because moça doesn't always come across as being polite. And never, ever call the waiter garçom. You learn this in Brazilian Portuguese, but do not call a waiter garçom. That is not nice. They're not going to like that. It's an empregado de mesa. So if ever you need to speak to the empregado de mesa, you're not going to say garçom and put your hand up. It would be polite just to put your hand up and say se faz favor, but not really to say garçom or any of this. This is not going to be very polite. So we're going to take a look now at articles. In the European Portuguese, we use the article for some things that we don't use the article for in the Brazilian Portuguese. So for example, names, we say o João, whereas in the Brazilian Portuguese, they don't really say o João, they'll just say João. We use it for the possessive, which is we use it for the possessive, o meu carro, for example, o meu carro. In Brazilian, you do not use it for the possessive. This is how I can tell when my students are cheating and they're using the Brazilian Portuguese, because I can see that maybe with the possessive they've not used the article and they haven't used the article with the name, and then I can see that they've been using Google Translate. So this is how I catch them out. The reflexive is much easier than the reflexive in Portuguese, in European Portuguese. The reflexive in Brazil always comes before the verb, which makes it a lot easier. Now, in European Portuguese, it will normally come after the verb, but there are certain exceptions. Certain adverbs will cause the reflexive part to come before the verb. For more information on that, check out the link below to the video talking about reflexives in European Portuguese. Now, Duolingo can offer a rich Brazilian Portuguese course, but it's not European Portuguese. But the thing is if you're starting out, that's not really a problem. I think far too many people worry over people learning Brazilian Portuguese. It's not a big deal. When you learn how to iron out the creases, it can actually be quite helpful. One, because it's easier to understand. So when you're watching certain videos or maybe even podcasts, you might find that you understand it easier than the European Portuguese. And two, you're still getting a good bit of grammar. Yes, some grammar you're going to have to tweak, but it's going to be the least. If you've been learning Brazilian Portuguese for a long time, don't feel like you have to relearn the language. You've just got to tweak a few little things so that you can start to speak in a more European way. I actually like the Brazilian accent, to be quite honest. The European and the Brazilian are farther apart than the American and the British. But at the end of the day, they've got a lot of similarities, and Brazilian people can understand Portuguese people can understand Brazilian people, and it just takes a little bit of getting used to the accent. Now, what I was thinking also is the use of você. So many teachers are like, you can't use você, it's rude, você is rude, você is rude. So what if you're speaking to somebody Brazilian and they use você, and then you think, they're being rude? No, they're not being rude. It's just how they speak. You, as a foreigner learning the language, if you say você, it's not the end of the world. It's not a problem. You can try and avoid it once you get to learn the verbs well, but it's really not a huge problem. So don't stress over these little things. Try and strike up conversations with your neighbours. Try and get a talk buddy, somebody you can chat with, maybe in a local cafe, maybe in a local shop, maybe one of your neighbours. And you can just try and strike a conversation with them and listen to how they sound, listen to the way they pronounce the words. It's essential to have European Portuguese material if you are learning the language and you have discovered that, yes, Brazilian has gone this far, but you can stop. So there's lots of stuff online. You can find TV, you can find a radio, there's lots of stuff on the internet. You can find audio books on some of the Portuguese websites that sell books. Take a look at the links down below, and you will find they're also one of the platforms I have. So if you've been learning the language and you find that you can't put anything together, sign up to that platform, take a look, listen to some of the stories, watch some of the videos, and you will get exclusive content in your inbox. You will also get access to a 12-lesson conversational course in video. So sign up today and don't wait for the new year. Anyway, I think I'm going to leave this here because I've got a lot of editing to do because a few things went wrong here. And I will see you next time. Incidentally, I always do this. If you have any questions at all, don't forget that you can put them in the comments below. I will be very happy to answer any questions you have. So if you have any questions at all, put them in the comments below. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Se Deus quiser.